Occasionally, I encounter people in my life who don't believe in certain religions or crackpot pseudo-scientific claims, but who are apologetic about people who do. And perhaps they even sympathize with my own criticism of these beliefs, but are not quite comfortable with it either. With an attitude of, who am I to tell someone they have no justification to believe something before they have doubted and thought through their claim. Doubt is perceived as something unsettling, and wrong belief, maybe as vice, maybe as sinful, seems perhaps sufficiently well-intentioned that it's unthinkable that the happiness and security that comes from belief could be an excuse for any negative consequence whatsoever. The attitude, I believe, reveals how human culture affects and deprives the imagination. Imagine if you lived in a world where belief is something dangerous and not some kind of placebo. Consider it, because you might just live in such a world. For some people, atheism is the first step. Others have been taught and brought up by the idea that factory farming is a necessary development, or even part of the natural order of things. Many other traditions foster similar kinds of vindications and vindicating conformity that they carry about them. The doctrine that faith is a virtue always implies an argumentum ad verecundiam, a Latin term. Hence the negating definition of the nihilists in the Russian youth movement of the 1860s by contemporary people, quote, who don't acknowledge any authorities, who don't accept a single principle on faith, no matter how much that principle may be surrounded by respect. To my astonishment, facts that describe nature or historical events can be, to some people, just as much a part of a pantheon of truth as, for example, Hephaestus was part of the 12 Olympian gods, or in ancient Rome, Jupiter was just another personification of Isis in the cult of Isis. If the term post-truth refers to anything, it refers to the belief in facts or alternative facts, as opposed to the examination of facts by science. Well, aren't facts to be believed in? Shouldn't we believe in truth? The answer is not difficult to come by. It suffices to look up any mediocre textbook on the theory of science. It might make reference to Popper's theory of falsifiability. What follows is the realization that in science, all possible descriptions of particular facts are hypothetical. None are authoritative. That means they can't be transmitted by tradition as precepts that ought to be believed in. Empirical science, empirical scientific facts are revisable and should be revised if false. One should think about whether they are true or not for oneself, and if you're not sure, don't become credulous or naive. You should revise them. You do it better than the teacher that cannot possibly know everything. What would that even mean? Do you revere your teacher as an omniscient God, as like someone who knows everything? What would be your motivation to revere anyone to that extent? Ah, well, but doesn't the abstraction of truth itself contradict the idea that there is nothing to be believed in? The answer is also a demystification via semantics. Let's get into a few technicalities. An abstraction is nothing but the particulars that it is supposed to describe. Truth is what the facts are, what corresponds with facts, such that a statement P is true if and only if P. And guess what? You should always verify whether P is really true. And yet an abstraction can be valuable just for that reason. To make discoveries, we require the imagination for a new theory. In doing so, we reimagine the world. We create a new cosmology that may or may not correspond with the facts. That's why we need to test what is knowable about explanatory theories against the unknown empirical outcome of an experiment, an unknown truth, an outcome contained within the theory as a prediction of it, as either corroboration, support, or refutation, contestation, on a very basic level. The idea that something in the abstract is true or good and evil, justice and injustice, meaningful and meaningless, is a linguistic and conceptual fiction. Allow me to turn on its head what the philosopher of science Karl Popper once said about moral standards. Like standards, in my opinion, truth is at worst a regulative idea. At its most meaningless and arbitrary, it is something like a law which sits there passively to be believed in, for most people to reverently extol. It may be a useful fiction to control people by state coercion, but if the Constitution does not recognize it as a fiction, created for a particular purpose by particular people at a particular time, an absolute principle can be used to justify any political injustice whatsoever. Truth does not exist as something to be believed in. There needed be conviction on my part that we will ever find the truth, and I even believe it is dangerous to live any other way than to see the truth as fundamentally unknown. To us, to see every experiment in my life as a scientific experiment, that is to say, one in which the outcomes are unknown. With the admission that, fallible as we are, we can never tell, for example, whether these outcomes co-equally exist as cause and effect to be discovered prior to the experiment. Otherwise, all rationality in science, as we know it, ceases. When people start believing in a metaphysical truth and try to justify it and support it with science, science in turn becomes an activity of seeking the already held belief, and testing and criticism cease because every real test becomes potentially devastating to the believer's irrational faith. I admit the reality of novelty and choice in the universe, and with it, that I have a responsibility for my own actions, including my changing beliefs in this changing universe. Whether it is possible to know anything about this chair I'm sitting in has never seemed a deep question to me. However, the limits of human voluntarism has. We can only do the best we can. But the question is, what is the best we can do? And it makes no sense to me that there exists a thing out there that we cannot grasp, or if we potentially could, should not grasp, but rather that we should believe in it as if that would accomplish anything